start. So this webinar will be recorded. It may be on our YouTube after. I'm not sure if we'll be posting it publicly or not, but I will have it available to send out to participants. So welcome everyone. My name is Tonya Scher and I am the Director of Schools at Seed St. Louis. My pronouns are she, her. So I'm just briefly going to talk about Seed St. Louis real quick in case you're not from the St. Louis region or you don't know that much about our organization. But we exist to empower people and communities to grow food. So the one way we do that with the school program is by providing free education through classes like this. Also, we go out to schools and do professional development sessions on a range of topics. We also come and do classes with youth. So if you work in a school in the region and would like us to come out and like model a lesson, we can do that as well. We do free consultations for schools, and we also have something called a garden development process that you can go through if you're wanting to start a garden at your school, or if you want to start a community garden, you can go through our 3-phase development process. And once you complete that, you're considered in our network, and you can find a map of our network of gardens online. This is just a screenshot of it, but you can find the interactive version on our website to see all the different projects that are part of our network. So if you do not currently have a garden at your school and you're within the St. Louis city or county or the Metro East region, and you're interested in starting a project, you can reach out to us and we can talk to you a little bit more about how that can happen. But once you join our network, you have access to other perks. So we provide infrastructure for a garden. You can then get free and discounted seeds and seedlings, access to volunteer groups. We have a tool loan program. So if you have a big garden project, you can borrow tools from us, and so on. So those are just some of the ways that we work to fulfill our mission to empower people in the community to grow food. So jumping right into our class tonight, this class is on using the garden to teach. So I do want to point out first thing that this is not a gardening 101 class. So if you came here hoping to get gardening skills, this is not the class for you. This class is more for folks who already have an established garden, or know a thing or two about gardening, and you are looking to understand how you can connect it to teaching with youth. So maybe you're a teacher and you want to connect your content area or curriculum, or maybe even you're a parent, you just want to find ways to kind of use the garden to reinforce some concepts that your child might be learning. But that's more kind of what this class is about. We'll also talk a little bit about just in general outdoor classroom management strategies, because teaching outside does look a little different than teaching inside. And again, I'll talk a little bit about some different ways that you can connect different content areas to the garden. I also should have pointed out in the beginning that this is webinar mode, so I can't see or hear any of you. There's no way for me to see or hear you. So if you have any question, please put that. You should have a Q&A bar at the bottom or somewhere on your screen, so you can drop questions in the Q&A. If you have resources you want to share with others or just comments, you can put that in the chat. You can also put questions in the chat, but it's a little easier for me to keep up with questions if they are put in the Q&A, so I don't have to scroll back through the chat. Since I don't have a moderator tonight, I'll most likely go look at the questions at the end of this presentation, but if I see some pop up, I'll try to answer them, but I'll definitely go through them all at the end. So feel free at any time to drop questions in the Q&A, or again, if you have resources to share, comments to make, you can put those in the chat for everyone to see. Okay, the first thing I want to do, so generally this class that I'm teaching tonight is usually one we do in person. So we do kind of a modified version of it when we go to schools and it's one of our professional development sessions. It does look a little different in person. We do a little more hands-on. But since I can't see any of you, I wanted to try to get a little interaction. So I just have 2 quick questions, and we're going to do that through the polls mode, which this is the first time I've used on Zoom. Hopefully it works. My first question, I just want to kind of gauge what your experience is with teaching in the garden. So hopefully you can all see a poll right now. If so, it should say, have you previously used the garden to teach? So you can say yes, no, or maybe you haven't, but you've taken your students outside, maybe not in the garden. Okay. So it looks like about half of you or a few of you have say yes, you have, a couple no, not at all, and some have used it. Okay. Or have used, I'm sorry, the outdoors to teach. I'm not sure if you all what you all can see on your end. So let's say it's kind of split. Um, Good to know. So the next question then that I have is a little bit more about, oops, why, if whether you have or not, what are some of the barriers that you have encountered? So this poll has a few more options. So I want to know whether you've taken your students out or whether you haven't, what are the challenges you face? So I think you should be able to select more than one on here. So is it lack of time, funding, or resources to maintain the garden? So the first one's more on like, you don't do it because it's difficult to maintain the garden. Is it because the transition time from the classroom out to the garden is just too much? It's difficult to make good use of that? Is it because you don't have the training or knowledge in gardening skills? Or is it because you don't have the training or knowledge in how to use the garden as a teaching tool? Do you have a lack of garden-based resources? Or just a lack of space for teaching in the garden? Maybe you have a garden, but it's just not suitable for students. Or if you say other, if other things come up, feel free to drop those in the chat. Maybe just another minute, and then I'm hoping that most of these barriers we can kind of touch on tonight. So it looks like the number one I'm seeing is lack of time, funding, or resources needed to maintain the garden. I'm also seeing a lack of training or knowledge and connecting to, I think I can actually share these results. Go. Training or knowledge and connecting the outdoors to the curriculum. Okay, so mainly lack of resources, not really knowing how to connect it to the curriculum, and then lack of time, funding to maintain the garden, which is a big one. So I will say that first one, the garden maintenance portion, is a whole nother class that we do. So I think we did it this spring. That was in person, I believe. Sometimes we do it virtual. But if your biggest barrier is garden maintenance, how to keep the garden, how to engage more people in the garden so that it can be maintained. Because of course, if you're trying to use a garden to teach, that's a whole nother job to keep a garden maintained, right? You can definitely incorporate the students into that garden maintenance, but it is another task in itself. So we do offer a class called maintenance and building capacity. We've done it in a few different, might have some different titles, but look for that class. We will probably do that again in the spring. So look for anything, class we have related to maintenance and capacity building. And in that class, we really talk about how to engage more teachers, more community parents, so that it doesn't all fall on you. You can also reach out to us. That's also a professional development session we teach. So if you're in our area, we're happy to come to your school and do a class on or a session on that as well. But I know that definitely one of the biggest that tends to be one of the biggest challenges, and that's because you all have a lot on your plate. And generally, schools they can't afford to pay someone to be the sustainability teacher or to to take on this other role. So we have found some ways to kind of try to work around that. But again, that's kind of its own session. So we might talk a little bit about that tonight, but we're really going to focus on some of these other challenges. So you're not alone, according to a study from 2018 from the American Journal of Public Health. I think it was about 90 teachers, I could be wrong, that were polled. And these were the main challenges that came up. So not too far from what I was seeing in this poll. So again, lack of time, lack of staff knowledge and engagement, lack of funding, which is another one we're not really going to get into tonight, but look for a class on how to fundraise for your garden in the future. That's definitely something we're looking to create a class on. But then just lack of curriculum, the resources, or even the time, because I should have prefaced this with I used to be a formal educator, so I can relate to any of you teachers here tonight. I very much understand that as much as you may want to use the garden to teach, it can feel unrealistic at times to kind of take on another thing. So we hope with this class and with the resources Seed St. Louis provides, it will not feel so much like an additional thing, but rather just something that can replace what you're already doing inside. So I am assuming if you all are here, then I don't need to convince you that school gardens are important and a great teaching tool. But just briefly, you know, they really are. They're good for lots of reasons, and you're starting to see a lot more of them nationwide. A lot more programs that support school gardens, a lot more school gardens, and we're starting to finally see more research too on why school gardens and even just learning outside is so important. So a few reasons here. There are actual studies that show the connection between improving indoor classroom performance and testing if students are getting outside to learn concepts. One, it breaks up the day, it gets them out of their seats. We all know that's an old school way of learning, sitting at a desk all day reading a book. Even in like the workforce, a lot of employers are looking more for experience over education these days. So anytime students can learn hands-on and have like real world experiences, we know there are numerous benefits. So that's one big thing the garden provides. Just a little bit of research to kind of back that, if you want to look a little more into some studies, so maybe you can convince other teachers or administrators, that the garden is a great tool for teaching. I understand some of these studies are a little outdated, but most of these studies on garden-based and outdoor learning are all still somewhat recent, kind of a new area. But again, there's a study from the American Institute of Research that showed students who enjoyed outdoor educational experiences usually increased their standardized test scores, had a better attitude about school, and improved in-school behavior, which is something you definitely see. Students that tend to sometimes be disruptive in class often shine when they're outside learning outside in the garden, when they have a special task and they get to kind of move around and learn in a different way than they do in the classroom. We also know that learning outside engages multiple styles of learning. And one of my favorite studies that supports outdoor education and garden-based learning is connected to greater memory and retention rates. And actually, when I first graduated for education years ago, there was a study similar to this, just that focused on how strong memory is linked to strong emotions, or the other way around. So, we know sometimes traumatic memories or traumatic experiences and emotions are also linked to memory, but it works the other way too. So strong positive emotions are also linked to strong memories. So even just moments of joy, like incorporating humor into lessons, students are more likely to remember those moments if it made them laugh. And especially moments of like awe, which is such a great emotion that's often experienced, I think, when you're learning outside in nature. Those moments of like sparked from curiosity and just like new discoveries. So awe and joy and excitement, which we see all the time when kids are learning outside and they discover something new, something neat with a plant or a new bug they haven't seen. So whatever they're learning in that moment are more likely to remember later because there was that strong emotion connected to it. And finally, the garden is, as I'll say probably many times tonight, it's a great place to learn so many different things. Aside from all of the content areas, the core content areas, it's just a great place for physical activity, to learn about nutrition, food systems, social justice, and social emotional development, as well as community and a sense of place. So if you've heard about place-based learning, that's somewhat, it's connected to all the PBLs, project-based learning and problem-based learning, all kind of similar, but place-based really focuses on creating a lesson, a unit around a place and a community, and the garden is a great place to start with creating those units. Okay. So as I said, the garden is a great place to learn all of these things. So we're going to talk about specific content areas in just a little bit and some ideas and things you can do to teach science, math, arts, all of that. But first, I want to cover just some essentials with outdoor learning, or at least I guess I should say tips and tricks, best practices that we have found work that have been tried, with other science programs or outdoor learning science programs, I should say. So first, I just want to say, think of the outdoor classroom as it's going to be a different space than the indoor classroom. One thing we refer to the garden as the outdoor classroom because we always want to make sure students realize it's not recess when you go outside. It is a classroom. It's still a place to learn. So that's why we use the term outdoor classroom when we're talking about the garden or anywhere outside that we are learning. But still, it's important to remember that your expectations should be a little different. Things are going to look different. Don't expect it to always be quiet and still. I understand, teachers have their different styles of teaching and, different students need different things, but it's okay to let go a little bit and give students a space to explore a little. Encourage play, exploration. The last thing you want to do is create negative connections to learning outside or to the outdoors. It's okay for them to maybe step away from a lesson for a minute when they see something exciting. We'll talk about that. I'll get back to that in a minute, but basically be okay with some distractions. Let those turn into learning moments. So a few of the main obstacles we sometimes see when teaching outdoors or sometimes teachers encounter, I just want to touch on and talk about maybe like how you can eliminate those or work with those obstacles. So first, getting dirty. We understand not all students want to get dirty. Everyone is different. One thing that you can do, we always try to encourage a positive attitude about dirt. There are some pretty neat studies out there about the microorganisms in dirt that actually can boost serotonin and make you happy. But again, we understand you don't have to be okay with dirt to be able to enjoy the garden. So there are gloves for that. You can always have gloves on hand for your classroom. Also having, doing a little walkthrough in the garden beforehand, making sure any seeding you have is cleaned off, bird droppings, things like that. Anything that's going to potentially be a distraction during the classroom, to be prepared for. Also just having good routines. So if students are going to help in the garden and do watering, making sure you have a good routine so that, if you just send some students off with a watering can and a hose, it could turn into a wet, muddy mess. So having routines and expectations set ahead of time. Moving around. So often the garden is a big open space. And it's very important to set clear boundaries. So whether you're using trees as boundaries or whether you have an actual fence, it's important that students know when you are giving them time to explore, or if that's part of the lesson, that they know how far they can go. So giving them clear guidelines with that. Also, again, developing a routine. So maybe every time you come out to the garden, the first thing you do is sit in a circle somewhere, maybe you have certain spots, but setting those routines early on, setting those rules, expectations, and repeating them constantly. Again, that's not a whole lot different than in your classroom, I'm sure. But it's very important to set those expectations and routines outside too, so they know what's acceptable and what isn't. And as I mentioned, distractions, it's going to happen no matter what you're doing or studying outside. There's going to be something cool, some kind of cool natural phenomena that happens that's going to distract one student, and then the whole class is going to follow. And that's okay. It's probably going to take less of your time to allow the class to circle up real quick. Okay, we can stop this project. Let's go see what John found over here. Circle up. ask questions about it. Maybe you can connect it to the lesson, take a minute, and then bring the class back to what you're doing. That's probably going to take less time than trying to pull each student that wanders over wanting to check out the school worm or whatever they found. And again, if there's a way, if it's encouraging curiosity and inquiry and it can be connected to what they're learning, then great. Why not allow a little bit of that? So, a few other tips and tricks. First I mentioned setting rules and expectations. This is always the first thing we'll usually use, like the very first garden class, doing this. And when I say garden class, I've even referring to taking kids out to garden. Sometimes that might be part of what you're doing, but we often like think of the garden just again as a teaching tool. So we might be going out there for math or for reading, whatever you're using. It's good to spend the first day that you're outside in the outdoor classroom with the students, setting together clear goals, guidelines, and again, repeating those. The first few classes, going over them every day. So just one of the easy ones we do. We also recommend keeping those short. You don't want to have too many rules. So we usually say we have 3, and within those 3, there are lots of kind of little rules, but be kind to plants, be kind to animals, and be kind to people. And within those, you have these other important rules. So be kind to plants. That means, we're going to be careful. We're not going to pull them out. We're not going to hurt the plants. We want to give them what they need to live. And also that comes, along with that comes like harvesting rules. So like we have a rule of 5, if you're harvesting greens, we always leave at least 5 leaves on them so they can continue to live. So there are other kind of mini rules we have within Be Kind to Plants that we talk about. Be kind to animals. So that can cover lots of things like what you can touch, what you can't touch. That's where we kind of can talk about bees and other things that might be an issue out in the garden, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. And then the Be Kind to People, that covers, of course, your typical rules, being respectful, raising your hand to talk, but that also is where you can kind of bring in tool safety. So how we use the tools, we're not using them, as weapons or as swords. So we're not swinging things around, and that's where we kind of go over tool safety. So that's one way that we kind of try to keep it easy, for if we're being kind to plants, animals, and people, we should be doing all of these other things within that. But we do also generally spend, a good whole day or class period going over all the tools we might be using and the safety of them, how we walk with things. If you have a small hand trowel or hand shovel, you're not running with them, you're keeping it down to your side, always walking in the garden, that kind of thing. Never run in the garden. There are lots of tools to follow with or trip on. And then also you can, when you're talking about these things, it's important to talk about food safety. So I mentioned what they can touch, but also what can they eat. So are students allowed to pick something off the vine and eat it? What are your rules on that? And again, when I talked about like being kind to animals, we also talk about what they might find in the garden. So often lessons involve exploring, finding things to observe. But that's where we talk about like feathers, other things they might find in the garden that might look cool, but like what can they touch? We always tell them don't touch feathers if you see them. You can look at them, but it's important to set all of those expectations that very first time you're out there and repeat those. Also, outdoor safety involving the sun, keep in mind sun and like bugs, that kind of thing. I always tell students, bees they will not sting you. They just want flowers. They want food. They won't sting you, of course, unless you're swatting at them, unless the bees are fearful for their life. So if a bee comes near and you stand still, then just let it kind of sense you out. It'll realize you're not a flower and it'll go away. But you also have to keep in mind that not everyone has the same experiences. Some people may have allergies. Some people, may not have access to sunscreen or certain bug sprays. So it's also okay to just not want to be around, wherever bugs are going to be. So it's important to also let them know, if you have, allergies or there's a reason you don't want to be around bees, make sure it's very clear to them why the bees are in the garden and where the bees will be. So they're going to be by the flowers looking for food. And another fun trick that we tell students to do if they encounter a bee or some kind of bug that scares them is something called bee fingers. So it's just that. You just do bee fingers. And we just say bee fingers is a way to let the bees know we're not going to hurt you. We're not here to mess with you. Just kind of like, hello, okay, now you can leave. So it's kind of a way to just the students kind of center themselves and be able to move if they get scared, but to move in a way that's not going to scare the bee, or cause them to sting them, rather than running or screaming or playing their arms around. It's just a way, bee fingers. And we found that's really successful with kids. They love doing it. It's like kind of their way of communicating with bees, and it really does help kind of keep them from getting scared or doing something that might scare the bee. Okay, so along with that, I also just put on here, Soulfire Farm has a food justice pledge. That's another thing that they recommend. If you haven't heard of Soulfire Farm, it's a great farm in New York, and they have a good youth program that's really centered on like food justice or food injustices. But they do, with their youth program, students kind of write their own like pledge at the beginning of the semester. You can find more of that on their website. A few more just tips and tricks that are important to use when you're teaching outside. So the walk and talk is a discussion routine that I love to use. It's great for transitioning out to the garden, and I'm going to come back to that in just a minute. I have a little video I can show on that. But circle up. These are just really basic things you can do that are just that they are successful to use out in the garden. So having students circle up is a good one because there are so many distractions and things to look at in the garden. So when you need everyone's attention, just telling them to circle up or using some kind of cue to get them where they need to be, and maybe making that a common way that you come together. It's a good way to have a discussion where everyone's kind of looking centered on you instead of all the fun things happening around them. Small group is always best practice when teaching in the garden or outside. Understand that's not an option for everyone, but if you have helpers or parents that are willing to come on the days that you're doing outdoor learning, that's always really helpful. It's always great to have small stations, just small groups in the garden tends to work better. Sit spots. So sit spots is just a way of centering yourself and really using all of your senses to tune in to what's going on around you. So it's not necessarily meditating and tuning out. It's more kind of the opposite. It's a way of, it's something you can have your students do at the beginning of each class for just a minute or so. But basically they find kind of their favorite place outside. They sit, they get comfortable, and they kind of use their senses to really take in everything happening. And it's good for them to kind of go back to that same spot every time they do it. So that way they can really kind of start seeing how things change. You know, if their spot is observing pollinator bed or a tree, you know, they kind of start to see day after day, like what's happening in that space. Wonder wall is something you can do indoors or outdoors, but just kind of having a wall, a place that kids can write things that they're wondering, things they're observing in the garden and questions they might have. We like to really use all our senses in the garden. So we do different things to help us see, to help us hear. So I like to connect that to nature. So we do owl eyes. It might seem really basic, but it's actually very effective to help students tune in on something. So another thing you can do is get toilet paper rolls, and you can tape them together to make like binoculars. And it's fun to use, but it really does help students to focus on one thing. If they're looking at something in the garden, again, there's always so much else going on, bugs flying around, birds, other things. So it helps them to just kind of focus what they're looking at. But we also just do it with owl eyes. So sometimes we'll spend a whole class just practicing these little techniques to use our senses in the garden. We can also use deer ears or fox ears. So, you know, we'll practice cupping our ears up and closing our eyes. And what sounds are we hearing above us? And then we practice moving them. So like how deers or other animals can move their ears. Then we'll like move our ears backwards and sit with our eyes closed for a while and notice how the sounds we hear change. You know, we'll cup them down You'll hear the grass blowing in the wind. So it's kind of fun to play around with that too. Help students kind of tune in to everything happening. What else? So having a good kind of cue to get students together. Again, the garden can be sometimes a noisy place. Sometimes there's streets nearby and cars. Um, Often the kids might be spread out doing different tasks. So it's good to have some way to get them all back together. Maybe that's a whistle. But if you're really creative, or if you can do a really good wolf call, that can be a fun thing to do. Or even using instruments. Sometimes we'll bring instruments out. Or you can even get, yeah, like I said, fun whistles if you get like a duck call or some kind of funny animal call, or have just this, these little cheap bird whistles that you can use. But having something that you use that the students know is a cue to come back and circle up, or whenever, their time is up with whatever they're working on. That's good to have outside in the garden. I mentioned bee fingers. And then also taking some time to have like mindfulness in the garden is always good to help kind of center them and prepare them for whatever they're about to learn. So maybe that's having sit spots where they are tuning in to everything around them. Maybe that's taking a minute to just journal outside. There are lots of different mindful activities you can do. So these things work great for, just being outside in general. Some materials that are great for when you're teaching outside or in the garden. And I know this looks like a long list, but really there's like 2 things that I would recommend always having, and that's something to write with and something to write on. So I would say the most important, well, and a magnifying glass is great. But it does depend what you're teaching out there. So if it's science, I would say a magnifying glass, but no matter what it is you're teaching, to just have a classroom set of clipboards with paper, or just a classroom set of notebooks, so like nature journals and some pencils. That's really all you need to learn outside. But then there are other things that if you wanted to put together like an outdoor classroom kit to take with you, that we recommend. So having magnifying glasses, I mentioned, those are always great. Binoculars, or even, like I said, your toilet paper roll, binoculars. Cameras, that's not like a highly recommended one, but that's fun if you can have that. And then having something to collect, especially if you're doing science or observation. So maybe it's just clear plastic cups. You can also get like the magnified jars, like the jars with the magnifying top. Or like I said, it can just be cups or glass jars, anything to like collect things and to observe. And then measuring tools. So maybe you have like a hanging scale, rulers, measuring tape. And then it's great to have something, portable dry erase board, whether you have one installed out in your outdoor space or just something you can bring in and out. Also having some kind of seating and shade, of course, is great. So if you go through our network, you can get seating from us as well with garden infrastructure like picnic tables. But a few other options are like those tree stumps a lot of people get. And I know if you're in St. Louis, the City of St. Louis Forestry Department will often deliver. They will definitely let you come and pick them up. They did used to deliver, and they still should if you get a hold of the right person, but they would deliver like classroom sets of tree stumps to schools because they have so many, they need to get rid of them anyway. So that's one thing to look into, but they can make great kind of sitting spots in the garden. Also garden kneelers, like what we would use to kneel on to work in the garden, those little 8-inch by 15-inch, or I don't know, 7 by 15-inch pads. Those can be great for students to sit on in the garden because they can easily carry them when they go outside. They're easy to clean and wipe off, and they can kind of put them anywhere in the grass to sit on. And then just your basics, having like a classroom set of hand trowels for kids for digging, gloves, and some small or regular size watering cans. Those are kind of the essentials. Again, not all of these are essential, but just a good starter list. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about different ways to connect your content to the garden. Jump in on time. Okay. So I'm going to start with science because that is probably the easiest, more obvious one. So let's see. Okay. So I'm going to start by just talking a bit about our curriculum, but I'm not going to spend too much time on that. But it is a free resource, science resource, if you are teaching elementary school in the garden. So if you go to our website, you can go under Seed to STEM, and this is where you can find the curriculum. It talks about it is we have a few units that are more focused on kindergarten through second, and some that are third through fifth. You can find the units under here. So adaptations, ecosystem, soil and compost, plant parts and care. And then we have on garden animals, kind of more suggested for the younger. So these are all science based. So you can look on it and you'll see, for example, adaptations. Every unit has an intro page. So that just kind of gives you an introduction to that unit. And then these are all lessons underneath the unit. If they have a little star, that means they have a like garden journal worksheet page that goes with them. So you can teach these in a progression, or you can also just pull them and use them as like a one out lesson. So they do all have next generation science standards aligned with them. We also put cross-cutting concepts in the science and engineering practices. So I know Missouri uses NGSS, but I think what most states do. So if you are teaching elementary and you use next generation science standards, then we already should have it pretty well aligned with those standards for each lesson. We also include on the lessons, you can see, one real quick so you see how they look. You can see the time of year they're recommended. Most of these are good anytime, but this is fall or spring outdoors, about a 45-minute lesson. So real quick, just how you can read them. There's an overview of the lesson, the objectives, teacher preparation, things that we recommend you do before you teach the lesson. They have a guiding question. And then the progression goes from exploring to digging deeper, and I'll talk more about this in just a minute, then to making connections. So that's all in that right bar. Then on the left bar, you'll see some things that you'll see. Here's where we have standards, materials recommended, the setting for the lesson, which is usually just the garden. And then you'll see some other things that kind of connect to the lesson on the left. So walk and talk is a discussion routine that we've mentioned. You can see over here under Explore. So that tells you a little bit about it. You'll see terms, that kind of thing. So that's just quickly kind of what the lessons look like and how you can read them. What else did I want to say about that? So I'm going to jump ahead. So these lessons were created based on this learning cycle from the Beatles Project. So if you haven't heard of the Beatles Project, it is the outdoor education project from the University of Berkeley, Lawrence Hall of Science. So they are a pretty big leader in science-based outdoor education. If you are interested in teaching science outdoors, I highly recommend going to BeatlesProject.org. They've got all kinds of good resources for teachers, just a lot of information there. So myself and another former Seed St. Louis staff member went to a week-long workshop there where we are really trained on how to kind of use their learning cycle and just all of their resources. So that's kind of how we based our curriculum on this learning cycle. So I just wanted to kind of cover that so you understand like how these lessons were made. This is kind of our version of the learning cycle. So in the exploratory phase of the lessons, you'll see that's where students are usually making observations or kind of being invited into the concept. Usually each lesson allows them, some time to just explore with some kind of guiding question. And digging deeper is when that concept invention is happening. And then making connections is where they're connecting with other students, sharing ideas and connecting it to maybe like a bigger concept. So that's just kind of in a nutshell what that looks like. So this is their learning cycle, and that's the learning cycle we kind of created based on that. So that's all I'll say about our lessons. I just wanted to make sure you know that that's a free resource and covers most of the life science and earth science are the main NGSS standards that we kind of have connected to the garden in that way. So before I move on to talk about other content areas, I want to talk a little more about teaching science outdoors, because again, it is the more obvious one that tends to be the easiest to kind of connect to your curriculum. But I think this can kind of also carry over to other content areas. But it's very important when you're teaching science outside to create a culture of curiosity and respectful discourse. So it's very important that students always feel physically safe, emotionally comfortable, and valued outside if you want them to be participants and excited about learning outside. So I can't stress enough just how important it is to give them the freedom to be curious and to ask questions. So again, like encouraging them to look for nature mysteries rather than, forcing them to kind of see what you're interested in seeing. Let them explore, let them find things that spark their interest, and modeling that yourself. There really is so much, even if, you have just a small green space and one bed. There's so much when you get down and really look close and get a magnifying glass. There's so much to see. There's, tiny ecosystems everywhere. So really teaching them how to tune in, how to take time to look for things, wait, look under a rock, look at all the life that's there. And doing it yourself. Students will notice, like, if you get excited about something, and they'll kind of want that same attention. So just, it's so important to model your own curiosity and encourage that with students. Also, outdoor science programs always focus on student-centered learning. So rather than the teacher sharing or telling students, it's more, again, encouraging them to ask questions, encouraging them to look for answers. So it should always be student-centered learning, involve a lot of peer-to-peer discussion and sharing of ideas, and focusing on broad versus narrow questions. So narrow questions are more like recall, like one word answer questions, or things like yes or no. So trying to ask fewer narrow questions, or at least saving those for the appropriate time, and focusing more on broad questions that have multiple answers, and involve students really kind of doing some exploring and looking for answers rather than just like a yes, no. Trying to think of, I know there's another name for those types of questions in formal education. I can't think of it now, it's slipping me, but I'm sure you all know. And making best use of transition time. I'm going to talk about that, I think, next. Okay, here's my video. Okay, there it is. Was it? So I'm going to talk about some discussion routines, and these do all come from the Beatles project. So these are just some effective discussion routines for teaching outside. So the walk and talk is one of my favorites to use. Some of you mentioned that the transition time from the classroom out to the garden, sometimes keeps you from maybe taking students outside, and you understand sometimes gardens are on the other side of the building, but you can use that time transitioning as part of your lesson. So I love using this. Even if you're already out in the garden, maybe you don't have a long transition time, this is still a fun way for students to have discussions while moving around. So the walk and talk, basically, if you can see this video here, I was able to get some of my lovely staff to pretend to be students. So basically this would look like the teacher. So Abby here in the purple is the teacher, and you get your class. You imagine this is a class of 20 rather than 4. But before you go outside, you have them line up in 2 equal groups. So if you have 20 students, you'll have 10 on the left and 10 on the right. You start by, I'm going to play this video and talk through it, telling them to find their partner next to them. They can give them a high five or a fist bump, or if they don't want to touch, a thumbs up. So just to make sure they know who their partner is. And then you tell them, in just a minute, I'm going to give you a question to discuss, and we're going to start walking. Whenever I stop walking, I'm going to turn around and do the shh, which is what she just did. And then you're going to turn around to the person behind you and do it, which is what they're doing. And then it just ripples back. So that's when students know to stop walking, stop talking, and listen. So this is something you can do while they're walking outside, and it kind of, for one, it makes use of that time transitioning. It's you're starting the lesson before you even leave the classroom by giving them a guiding question, setting them up for whatever they're about to go out and learn. So for example, like one lesson we use the walk and talk with, it's focused on making observations. So we start the question before we walk outside is like, what kind of people make good observers? Now we're going to walk and you're going to talk to your partner about that. And as they're walking, they're talking to their partner, like what kind of people. They might say, like, oh, detectives or policemen. Sometimes they'll say, my mom is a good observer. So that's what they're doing now. They're discussing the question. And then whenever you want to, you think they're finished, you stop, you do the shh, they do it, and they pass it back. And then you ask them to share out what are some things that you talked about, or what are some things your partner talked about that you thought were interesting. They raise their hand, they give you some answers. And then you repeat that, or you give them a new question. But before you do that, you have them kind of switch up who's in line. So now they get a new partner. So you're going to tell, I think we do that in the video here. Just a minute. You tell someone from, like, the first person from this row to go to the back. Everyone steps up one, they find their new partner, and give them another question and keep walking. And you repeat that same routine. So anyway, I thought a video was made it a little easier to show you how that works. But I really love using the walk and talk because, again, the students are moving, they're discussing, it kind of keeps them focused as they're transitioning out to the garden. Or like I said, I've even used this just when we're already outside, just to kind of have them move around and talk. So that's the walk and talk. Whip around is just a really quick discussion routine you can do outside, at the end of a class, or if you don't have much time and they're kind of spread out, you just go through all the students and have them give you a quick 1 or 2 word answer. The tape recorder, and these could be used inside too. But the tape recorder is when you have 2 students, they pair up. One of them's the talker, the other one's the recorder. The talker gets to talk about, whatever the question is or whatever you're having them discuss. They get to talk. The recorder listens, and then once the recorder is kind of heard enough, as much as they can process, they then tell them to stop, and then they repeat what they said. So it's kind of like the recorder taking it in, and then they repeat it back to the talker. So they're just good ways to help them practice listening and digesting what they're hearing. 2 cents is kind of similar. I guess it's a small groups, not 2 people, but you can have small groups of students. Each one gets 1 minute to go around and share. So whatever you are having them discuss, they each get a minute to talk on, and then afterwards they each get a minute to share out on what the rest of their group, to kind of respond to what everyone else said. And then think, pair, share, that's kind of an old school one. Most teachers know about, but where students are kind of individually, they get some time to think about what you've asked them, and they pair up, share that with another student, and then share out. So these are some nice, effective discussion routines to use outside when you are doing science-based learning in the garden. Okay. So now I want to talk a little bit, short on time. I'm going to kind of brace through these. I want to be mindful of everyone's time. Again, I can share this out afterward with you all. Just going to go through some different content areas and a few ideas that you can use in the garden. And English language arts, it's endless what you can do out in the garden. Connecting vocabulary to plants, all the different types of writing you can do outside. You can have them write like how-to, a guide or a cookbook. Have them write thank you notes to volunteers, donors that helped with the garden, or even writing notes asking for donations for the garden. That can be a lesson. Nature journaling is a huge one, which hopefully I have a minute to talk about, but keeping a nature journal is just one of the best things to use out in the garden. It involves writing, it involves drawing, and also numbers, which I'll talk more about in a minute. Even just taking the students out to the garden to read. So math is also a really easy one to connect to the garden. There's kidsgardening.org. I believe it's through them. They have a book that's all about math in the garden. Um, but there's so many ways, when using, you can create crafts in the garden. You can do square foot gardening, measuring your harvest, weighing your harvest. Yeah, I mentioned the square foot. So doing like perimeters, just measuring seed depth and seed spacing. Using calendars in the garden, tracking growth, again, graphs, yeah, and comparing sizes. We like to use body parts a lot in the garden too. I mentioned like bringing out rulers, but if you don't want to carry all that out, you can estimate. You can say, you can use hands. So how many hands is this plant, or how many fingers? We often use like this. Generally, depending on the size of the student, can be like the length of a foot. So we can go back inside then once we're in the classroom and say we measured, and the vine was 3 of these long, and then we can measure, and then we know how long it was. So you can also use body parts if you don't have rulers to do measuring out in the garden. Social studies, another easy one to connect. So many different ways, but just some of my favorites. Lots of cultural connections you can make to the garden. Historically, reading about different like gardening methods or agriculture methods. We have a list here. So we used to, at our demonstration garden, we had regional beds where we planted. So we had like a South American bed, and we've got this list I can share out. But this is actually a list of crops that grow in our specific zone. So they might not be from there. None of these are native here, but they actually do well in our growing area. So if you're studying sub-Saharan Africa, these are all things that grow well in St. Louis, in our area, that are originally from that region. So Eastern Mediterranean. So a great way to connect students to geography and to where the food actually comes from. And South and Central Asia foods, all of these foods grow in the Missouri hardiness zones of 6A and 7B. And these are the different regions of the world that they are native to. So lots of lessons that can come out of growing things based on the region, and doing whole units based on that. Again, talking about commercial versus small scale agriculture, the climate impact, food system and food access, history of farming and labor. And again, those community and place-based projects can be great. I know I'm kind of breezing through these. It's just kind of a starting point. Art, I just recently did a class all on art in the garden, and it's one of my favorites to do. There are lots of plants, crops, edible crops you can grow that can also be used for art projects. So things like making stamps out of potatoes, making mosaics out of seeds, using mud to paint, making pine needle brushes for painting, a garden loom. I wish I had a photo of one of those, but they're really easy to make. You can use any kind of frame and put yarn, and just making a really basic loom and letting kids weave things they find in the garden through it, and even watching how it kind of changes as it dries and colors change. Making nature mandalas from things found in the garden. So using like different colors of leaves to make like creating like a symmetrical mandala. Again, nature journaling involves sketching and drawing things in the garden. You can also make natural dyes, lots of things like beets and lots of vegetables, beets and cabbage and onions that you can boil down and make dyes from. But you can also use them. You can also use like flowers to like pound the pigment. So if you take bright colored flowers, you can put them down on fabric and pound them with something hard, and that pigment will transfer. So a lot of fun art projects you can do in the garden as well. And then music. I think anything you do inside, you can do out in the garden. But even making your own instruments from things like gourds, you can dry, using seeds, making maracas, clapsticks, using, rocks and sticks, all of those handmade instruments you can do, studying instruments and songs connected to different cultures that were made from items in nature, creating a sound map of the schoolyard. That's also part of nature journaling, and then just practicing those listening and observation skills. Okay, a few different theme gardens that you can do based on what you're teaching. So art and music, you could make a garden that's a rainbow garden. So planting things based on the color, having like a row of green vegetables, a row of red things, tomatoes. So that can be a fun kind of art project. Growing plants specifically for making dyes. So I mentioned from if you attend my art in the garden class, I had a whole list of different plants that you can use for that, but you can also do your own research. I'm going to give you a good art resource at the end of this of plants where you can find plants that make good dyes. You can grow stuff like the gourds for making birdhouses, or growing specific pollinators that will attract birds and things like that. Cereal gardens. So like for nutrition, you can grow things with grains for cereal. You can have a herb garden, a pizza garden. So growing things like tomato and basil and peppers or things you might want to put on a pizza, salad garden, tea garden, all of these fun ideas. So you can themed gardens can be a lot of fun too with students. I also mentioned the regional or like the Three Sisters garden you may have heard of, which is cultural connections. Some things to spark your ideas. Okay, so I'm almost finished here. Just a few kind of really easy ways to start in the garden. If you haven't never taken students out, the 3 eyes is a really great way to get students to start just like tuning into the garden. And that's I notice, I wonder, it reminds me of, and these are all part of like scientific inquiry. So I notice is making observations. So having students find something, observe it, and share or write down in their journal, what do you notice about that thing? Look at this leaf or this plant. What do you notice? Having them finish that sentence, and then what do you wonder? So they're moving on from observations to asking questions about that thing, and then what does it remind you of? So that's where they start making connections of that thing they're observing. So this is just a really easy thing you can do anytime, anywhere. You're outside if you want students to really kind of tune in and start observing and asking questions about something in the garden. And then I keep mentioning nature journaling. I also do a class on this, and it's just one of my, it's one of the easiest things to do in the garden. Like I said, having something to write on and something to write with. There are so many nature journaling activities you can do. They don't all look like this. It's not always just sketching and measuring something. There are a lot of fun nature journaling activities, and you can find all of those in this book I have done here, John Muir Law's Opening the World Through Nature Journaling, which you can actually download for free online. You can buy the book or you can download the PDF free. So I highly recommend that. There is specific ELA, like poetry, nature journaling activities, but then there's also science. It talks about best practices in journaling, but really nature journaling and it involves 3 different languages. So that's drawing. So that's where kind of art comes in, writing, and quantifying. So using numbers and measurements. So really great way to connect that to different content areas. It can involve drawing maps in the garden. It can involve tracking an area over time, making a field journal or field guide of like all the herbs in your garden. Just so many ways you can use nature journaling. So I highly recommend you check out John Muir Law's Opening the World Through Nature Journaling. Okay. So now the only thing left is to get outside. And we always encourage people to take students outside, not just on the nice days, but even in bad weather, because it saves them from spending their life merely tolerating the bad days in favor of a handful of good ones, a life of endless expectations and conditions where happiness hinges on sunshine. So we keep rain jackets with us for kids. So if it's raining, we can still get outside at least for a minute, even in the winter. Our educator, Abby, last winter, she did a class all on how to use the garden in the winter. So there are even things to observe and do out in the garden in the winter when things aren't growing. I think that's about it. These are some resources I mentioned and other resources I recommend. Again, I know this is just kind of touching on a lot of this. An hour isn't a lot of time to dive too deep into this, but if you are in the region and you want to, in the St. Louis region, we do free consultation. So if you're specifically a math teacher and you want to learn more how to connect math or art, you can reach out to us. We're happy to come out and meet with you, and discuss, like, help you connect the standards to the garden. So that way it's not extra work for you. We want to make it as easy as possible for you to use the garden as a teaching tool. Again, Beatles Project, they're a great resource for outdoor science education. Life Lab is just one of the big leaders on like school gardens. You can find a lot of good stuff there. This is the nature journaling curriculum, John Muir Law's nature journaling. If you are interested in art, Cornell University, has a really great, it's called Dig Art curriculum on their website. They actually have a lot of good, they have a whole kind of school garden based learning section of their website altogether. So also nutrition, other areas, but I really like their art curriculum or activity ideas. The School Garden Support Organization is a great like national kind of like hub for all like school gardening things. So it's kind of a hub for organizations like Seed St. Louis that support school gardens, but you can find so much there. They have research, they're connected to Life Lab and all of these other organizations. They put on it's not annual, biannual, every other year they have the School Garden Summit. So in 2024, next March, it will be in San Diego. So you can also find like classes, lots of webinars on their website. Kids Gardening is a great resource for lessons and ideas. And then hopefully by next spring or summer, we are kind of redoing our school portion of our website. So we're hoping to have a lot more resources and like downloadable tools. So keep your eyes open for that. I see a question in here. Someone asked if there's an organization like this in Arkansas. That's a good question. I know of organizations that are similar to ours in other states, but I'm not that familiar with what's in Arkansas. But I will certainly look into that. And I know I see, Jennifer, that I have your email. I believe I should, for signing up. So I'll see what I can find. Let me think about that. Or if anyone else knows of organizations in Arkansas, feel free to share. But I will look into that. I don't know if there are organizations that help start gardens, but there might. School gardening is becoming such a bigger thing. I mean, just in my 6 years with Seed St. Louis, I've seen it grow into something that it wasn't 6 years ago. So I'd be surprised if there's not some kind of similar resource, but let me look into that and I will get back to you. Else, if any questions or resources or things to share, others. So I will send this, you should be able to send the recording of this presentation out if you attended. So then you can also have access to that crops sheet I pulled up with the different regional crops and just all of these other resources. Okay, well, if there are no other questions, then we will stop there. And I thank you all for attending and happy planting. Hope you all have a great, I guess the season's almost over now, but a great 2024 gardening season. Bye.